recording. There we go. So you can go for it, and then after, you've been here before, so you know exactly how we do this. After 40 minutes to about an hour, if you finished earlier, that is great, and then we will basically open up the lines for questions. So you can go for it.
Good. All right. Well, hello, everybody. My name's John Ferrer. My computer apparently is tied to some guy named Jackson Daniels, so I'll answer to either for the time being. Here, I'll share my screen. How do I share my screen? I think that'll work. I'll share my screen with you all so you can see what's going on, hopefully. Yeah, I got a Facebook notification this morning about 10 o'clock my time that there's a talk that I should really tune in for. That sounds like it'd be really interesting, from Matt Dillahunty's wife, Beth. She was going to give a pro-choice defense, just arguing for the pro-choice position. I said, oh, that sounds interesting. Maybe I'll tune in. And I asked about the person speaking, and he said, well, unfortunately, she can't be there, or she had to turn it down. So I ended up taking up the position. So I'm going to be playing the devil's advocate today. I'm going to make a pro-choice case, even though I am vehemently pro-life myself. I'm going to try to stick to the key talking points that I hear from pro-choicers, who sometimes call themselves abortion choice or other terms if they don't like the pro-choice rhetoric. I'm going to try to stick close to the talking points, the key points of defense that are used, the key understandings that circulate, and hopefully make a better case than some of the ones I've heard before. Oftentimes, when I would get in debates with pro-choice advocates, they'll give just a few radically misrepresentative points that, honestly, I have to kind of take, repackage, extract whatever the best point is within it, and then hand it back to them to have a better argument, because the argument just flew right past what a refined pro-lifer would be saying. So I'm going to try to stick close to that. And at the end of it, I welcome your feedback. Just lay into me. I'm going to try to make the best pro-choice case I can make. And hopefully I won't convert anybody to pro-choice. All right, let's get started. So pro-choice or anti-choice, the choice is clear. This may seem like a bit of rhetoric at this point, but there's a key point to be made. Obviously, when you mention choice 3 times in such a short span, your key point of emphasis is choice, liberty, freedom. This is an emphatic point for the side of abortion choice advocacy. Choice is a concept tied into free will, tied into freedom, liberty, basic human rights, and that's going to be the point of emphasis here. So 10 reasons why abortion choice should remain legal. 10 reasons why abortion choice should remain legal. First, the fetus isn't a person. Personhood was decided in 1973 by Roe versus Wade. Essentially, the court and some of the best minds in the country, with some of the best defenses on both sides, were making the case about whether to consider the fetus a person. The ruling at the conclusion of that trial, of that case, was that fetal personhood is a contradiction in terms. The fetus does not satisfy the criteria one needs to qualify for legal personhood. Legal personhood, or not necessarily debating the philosophical side of it, which if we had it, would probably factor in favor of the pro-choice side, because the philosophical debate about what is a person hasn't been resolved yet. There's still debates about it, materialists and spiritualists and whatnot, saying there's a soul, there isn't a soul, does it have free will, is it determinist, what does it take to constitute a person? Well, if that's not decided in the philosophical realm, we don't have much hope of resolving it elsewhere. At minimum, though, we're just talking about legal personhood. Some different qualities of the fetus suggest that it doesn't yet qualify for legal personhood. Namely, it lacks consciousness. Lacking consciousness, it cannot suffer. Without the ability to suffer, it has no desires for happiness or well-being. It has no desires whatsoever. And so it doesn't really qualify for quality of life rubrics. Folks that want to say that it has sanctity of life, that's a different argument. It doesn't have a quality of life because it doesn't experience any quality whatsoever, positive or negative. Citizenship begins at birth, according to the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment, if you're familiar with U.S. Constitution, talks about citizenship rights. At what point does an individual qualify as an American citizen? And it's at birth. And hence we've got laws regarding immigrant births. Someone moves to the U.S. illegally even. If they have a child on U.S. soil, that's a U.S. citizen. But it's birth that signifies citizenship. And without citizenship, you don't have civil rights. And civil rights are an extension of human rights. There's also another objection that can be raised at this point. Suppose you are in a, oh gosh, I'm losing the term. You're in a fertility clinic, and you find out in this fertility clinic that the lab is going up in flames. It's starting to burn, and you realize you've got all of these fertilized eggs, these embryos that are in storage on ice, so to speak, and they are about to be ruined in this fire. Now, you also happen to have your child there, a birthed child, say 3 years old. If you had to choose between, say, 10 vials of embryos versus your own child that is birthed, well, which do you choose? Well, obviously, you would choose the child over the 10 vials. And the implication is that we recognize a distinction between a child after birth versus an embryo or fetus before it's been born. There's something we recognize that's different there. And as a pro-choicer, one can say that's personhood. That's the difference. And legally speaking, a person would be more responsible if they left living, breathing human beings in a burning building that they could have saved versus leaving embryos and fetuses in a burning fertility clinic. Now, also, personhood wouldn't be enough anyway. Thank you. It wouldn't be enough anyway because, see, did I skip backwards? I'm going the wrong way. Okay. Personhood wouldn't be enough anyway, according to the some of the arguments developed in David Boonin's A Defense of Abortion in 2002. Excuse me. Abortion needs only to be permissible to be legally justified. It only needs to be permissible to be legally justified. His distinction is between prescription, that is something is ethically required of a person, you should do this, versus proscription, you should not do this, versus permission, which is that you have ethical freedom to do this or not do it. You do not have ethical permission to force it. And that's a key distinction. It's going to build into the next point, which is going to tie into this. Personhood wouldn't be enough anyway, because all you need is ethical permission for the legal standard to give it room. If it's permissible to commit an abortion, it's not ideal, doesn't have to be good, it just has to be permissible for the legality to follow. And when we combine that with Judith Jarvis Thompson's Defense of Abortion article, where she establishes the violinist argument, we start to get a very powerful case that renders the personhood aspect irrelevant. Now, bear in mind, the personhood argument doesn't bode well in many ways for the pro-lifer, because pro-lifers who depend on personhood are anchoring in a lot of unresolved philosophy that isn't likely to solve itself anytime soon. But even if we granted personhood, according to the violinist argument and ethical permission from Boonin, we have a trump card. Now, according to Judith Jarvis Thompson's violinist argument, the story goes something like this. It's a thought experiment. Imagine you were this big fan of a violinist, a particular violinist. She gives a name just for the sake of argument. And you go to bed one night and wake up the next morning and find that you've been kidnapped and you have been tethered physically, like your organs are now connected to this violinist, because this violinist, as it turns out, has a fatal kidney disease. But this violinist can live indefinitely into the future, normal human lifespan, indefinitely, if this person can share your kidneys for 9 months. Now, you both will be using the same kidneys, but if this person can share for 9 months, tethered to you, and you're stuck in a hospital bed and they're stuck in a hospital bed, then this person can live. You have the physical endowment to provide the life care for this person, that after 9 months, they can be autonomous individuals and live on their own. This violinist would be viable. Now, the interesting part of this argument is that you don't have to attack personhood. You can grant personhood. No one, pro-life or pro-choice, is denying that this violinist is a person. But how does that bind on you as an individual? It doesn't. You don't owe them anything. That's your body, your right. Now, this violinist argument has been, by many regards, the most powerful, most important pro-choice argument in the history of pro-choice apologetics. But also in the same article, Thompson develops another line of argument that doesn't get as much play, but is in many ways comparable in its importance. The intruder argument. If you open the window because you want to get a breeze inside, the house is a little warm, you want to get some airflow, get some sunshine, so you open a window. Is opening that window permission for a thief to come in? Well, obviously it's not. Just because you open a window doesn't mean you're granting legal or ethical access to your home from a thief. If that thief comes in uninvited, then you still have a right to kick them out or even shoot them as an intruder. Their life is not your responsibility. Now, no one's denying that this thief is a person. Everyone can grant that this thief is a person. But granting that the thief is a person, you'd have to do more than establish personhood to show that she somehow owes this intruder access to her house just because she opened the window. And obviously opening the window is akin to the act of intercourse where a woman could be impregnated. Now, what we're getting to, and it's probably a summary of the pro-choice argument overall, is it's her body, her rights, or what's called my body, my choice. This line of argument is sometimes termed autonomy, privacy, liberty, but the formal language for it, dating back to Griswold versus Connecticut in 1965, is the right to privacy, or the right of privacy. This is an understood right that in private matters, namely the bedroom, marital intercourse, for example, it's a woman's privilege to decide what to do with her reproductive options. Now, in Griswold versus Connecticut, that was actually about contraceptives. At the time, if it weren't for the direction of feminism at the time, and advocacy for women's rights, then the right to privacy might have never been established in this landmark case, Griswold versus Connecticut. At the time, the argument was that contraceptives should not be allowed at all, even for married couples. And so that case established that in reproductive choices of married couples, they have a right to use contraceptives if they so desire. Now, this right to privacy would come back again in 1973 in Roe versus Wade, and concurrently the Doe versus Bolton trial, where the right to privacy and reproductive rights was extended to cover also abortion choice. Entailed as a human right, privacy is what it takes to be able to protect your life. If something is going to threaten your life, that you have a private opportunity to hinder. Say a woman has a potentially fatal pregnancy, the developmental problem, the child didn't implant at the right place in utero, and she's going to die if she doesn't abort. Her life is contingent on her right over private decisions about her own body. Likewise with liberty, if she wants to go into a certain career, she should have the liberty to pursue that career as it involves bodily decisions. And then, of course, pursuit of happiness. Now, life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, as well as the pursuit of property, these are woven into the language of the Declaration of Independence and in the Bill of Rights, namely the 14th and 15th Amendments. The logic is fairly straightforward, oftentimes intuitive and unstated, but for the sake of record, bearing the most responsibility regarding her body, she deserves the most liberty. The pro-choice argument here is that she carries the most responsibility regarding acts on her body, therefore she deserves the most liberty. Now, we could also argue that women's equality demands abortion choice. If you've read the Roe v. Wade decision, then you know that there's a vast history of sexism that went into the legal decision of Roe versus Wade. I'm not going to retrace all of it here, but pro-lifers would do well not to play this down or pretend that sexism is no big deal. It's a very big deal. And abortion choice is an attempt to resolve at least one big part of historical sexism. If men can cut and run from pregnancy, then women should be able to as well. Seems fair, seems logical. If men can get a girl knocked up and then skedaddle, then why can't women also leave their pregnancy behind? Before Roe versus Wade, women had to approach sex in a radically different way than men. This was forced discrimination, where women were not allowed to exercise the technological and medical privileges that we have in the modern age. They weren't allowed to use that to further advance their own equality and liberties in the eyes of the law. Previously, the law was tougher on mothers than on fathers. And in many ways, this could still be argued today that mothers still have a raw deal compared to fathers. Abortion choice is one big step towards giving women the opportunity to approach sex and pregnancy in roughly equal ways with men. Another big part of it, and perhaps the most visceral aspect of the abortion choice debate, visceral being quite literal here as well as metaphorical, is it can be summed up as no more coat hangers. I had to explain this to my students in high school when I was teaching ethics class. I would assume that most everybody understands what we're getting at, but just for the sake of clarity, when abortion was illegal, people would be left to use other measures to conduct abortion. And theoretically, if they could do it in private, If they could do it without the notice of medical professionals or the law, then they could get away with it. And coat hangers offered a means of going up inside the birth canal and killing the child and pulling it out on their own. But what we have, unfortunately, is that with the pro-life argument, many folks think that somehow banning abortion is going to prevent them, as if abortion is just going to go away because of some law. The same logic people will use for guns, they won't use for abortion. The logic with guns would be, well, obviously, if you ban guns, then if you make guns illegal, then the only people who have guns are people who got it illegally. So essentially, you're empowering an armed criminal elements and disempowering the non-criminal elements. They can't defend themselves. Same logic works with abortion. If abortion is illegal, then the only people getting abortion are getting illegal abortions. And consequently, they're more likely to get unhealthy, unsafe abortions that not only cause undue stress and strain within the birth canal and the womb, but might even kill the mother. If banning abortion doesn't prevent abortions, then banning abortion forces women to seek their abortions in illegal and unsafe ways. These are sometimes called back alley abortions. Banning abortion would thereby victimize women, making criminals out of decent, normal women. Pro-lifers might be led to think that pro-choice women are all bra-burning feminazis, when in fact, a great deal, perhaps up to half, of women seeking abortions are churchgoers, many of which are evangelical and would call themselves Christian, at least by upbringing and birth and experience since their own births. So it would be presumptuous to think that somehow the only people getting abortions are ones that fit this stereotypical liberal, progressive feminazi who can't stand the law as it stands because they're trying to bend and twist the Constitution to mean all kinds of new things that it never meant. No, many of the women who are currently getting abortions are self-proclaimed Republicans and Christians, and in the eyes of many pro-life advocates, many of these women would just be normal, decent women. If you were to ban abortion, then you're going to make all of those women into criminals. The no coat hanger argument has played out in recent history in the death of at least a few mothers. Savita Halapanavar, a 31-year-old Indian woman who was 17 weeks pregnant, entered a hospital in pain. Now, bear in mind, this was not in the US. This was in Ireland, which has stark anti-abortion laws. Abortion was not even legal, even in the case of dire threat to the mother's life. Days later, she entered a hospital in pain and in the middle of a miscarriage. Days later, the fetal heartbeat faded. She died of blood poisoning. Her husband, who now grieves with her family and her native India, said doctors refused to perform an abortion, which he believes might have saved her life. Now, if I was trying to manipulate emotions, I might use some of the pictures from that. But I've seen pro-lifers use pictures oftentimes in overzealous ways, and I wouldn't want to run that risk here. Pro-life positioning is also bad biology. If you are familiar with medical abortions and with the medical and embryological terminology within the category of abortion, then you know that miscarriages are abortions too. Even Bill Nye made a video recently about this, assaulting pro-life advocates with just some knowledge that miscarriages are abortion too. Well, if we're going to ban abortion, are we going to ban miscarriages? That seems absurd. we would need to have a principled distinction in place so that we aren't being overzealous here. Miscarriages happen, and sometimes they can even be self-induced by different behaviors and practices. Sometimes old wives' tales about how to induce this privately, so you don't even have to go to an abortion clinic. You don't even have to notify a husband. You can just, I don't know, do double time at your Tai Bo class and miscarry afterwards. Or you can subject yourself to injury or duress or diet habits that would supposedly induce miscarriage. Now, we can clone whole human beings from skin cells. Now, you might not have known this, and even though cloning of human beings isn't exactly legal just yet, we still have the technological capacity to clone human beings. Does that mean, now follow me here, does that mean that a case of dandruff is the moral equivalent of a Holocaust? If we're going to treat the smallest something that could become a full adult human being, then we need to deal in somatic cells, skin cells. But that would make a case of dandruff the moral equivalent of a Holocaust. Now, clearly that's absurd. Hence, pro-life advocacy is shackled to bad biology. The pro-life position is also hypocritical in several ways. Every anti-abortionist I've run into so far, or at least a great many of the anti-abortionists I run into, advocate for the death penalty. Are they pro-life or aren't they? Do they really believe that all lives matter, or do they only believe that the lives of unborn fetuses matter? Or are they drawing some arbitrary distinction here? Clearly, if they're going to advocate for the rights of human lives, then they would not be advocating for the death penalty. They don't care about babies once they're born. This is important. You'll see all sorts of people giving to causes about pro-life marches and pro-life campaigns and pro-life prayer rallies, but you don't see the same advocacy once the child's born. And so we still have a crisis of women who maybe they're pro-choice, but they didn't want to have an abortion in their case. But they're still single moms. They're still struggling. They're still in poverty. Pro-lifers oftentimes are nowhere to be found. They want the women to have that trouble, but they only endure enough trouble to say, make sure you absorb that burden yourself, or you give it up for adoption so that for 9 months your employment, your family, your whole life is impacted with a pregnancy you didn't even want to have. They don't care about mothers as much as their parasitic fetuses. Now, there's a sense in which the fetal human is a parasite within the mother. It is soaking up nutrients, soaking up resources. It's just sitting there. It's a mooch. It is not necessarily something that she wants inside of her. Pro-lifers will look at that fetus and value that fetus oftentimes to the neglect of the mother. That fetus's life is important, even if it only has the prospect of future possibilities. Meanwhile, this woman, this mother, she has a lot of real opportunity in front of her that is going to have to be radically revisioned. Much of it thrown out the window now that she's pregnant, now that she has a child that this pro-lifer thinks she needs to carry to term. In this way, pro-lifers can be hypocritical, favoring some lives over others. Pro-life positioning also wants to fuse church and state. It's a deeply religious campaign. You might have heard the phrases sanctity of life, and that phraseology will come in a lot. But the notion of sanctity, that means holiness. That's a religious concept. It's religion, it's theology, and it forces a religious aspect into a deeply political debate, suggesting that the pro-life position wants religion to be directing and pulling the strings in our politics today. That's a fusion of church and state and a violation of freedom of religion. The pro-life movement is staffed almost entirely by Christians, and churches are the primary financiers for the movement. Likewise, you can also find Jews, and you can find some other religious influences in the U.S., but overwhelmingly the Christian church is the chief backer for pro-life causes. And if Catholics had their way too, they would be banning contraceptives, so that not only would it be illegal to discontinue a pregnancy, it would be illegal for you to prevent a pregnancy in the first place, so long as you're having sexual relations. Christianity, as you may be well aware, treats women like second-class citizens and baby factories. If you're familiar with verses in Ephesians, a lot of the Old Testament verses, I believe also in 1 Peter, there are references to how women just don't have the full status and equality with men. And this keeps women in a second-class status. Part of the sexism historically across the history of Western civilization, part of the reason for that sexism is Christian influence, which oftentimes in the hands of human beings subjugates women. Yeah. Now, if you don't believe me about this religious influence, you can look up abolishhumanabortion.com. These are the chief namesakes for the abolitionist campaign. You can see up here the insignia that will appear oftentimes. Well, on their front page, you can scroll down just a tad and see that they understand they're advocating for abolition of abortion via the Christian gospel. It's in the heading. It says it says gospel just in the heading there. Human beings are created in the image of Almighty God, the very creator of the universe. And then it talks about Christianity specifically. These folks are not just interested in a bioethical debate. They're interested in forcing religion into the public square so that people have policies that are decided on a Christian basis, irrespective of whatever their religious or non-religious choices might be. This is legislating a particular religion. Pro-lifers also fare poorly when it comes to cases of rape, incest, and fetal deformities. One could even say they don't care about cases of rape, incest, and fetal deformities. This follows from the course of argument so far, in that there's less interest in the mother and society and the family as there is in those unborn fetuses. The hard cases divide even pro-lifers. Even pro-lifers aren't quite sure what to do about cases of rape, incest, and fetal deformities. And many pro-lifers will attack other pro-lifers, and they'll end up contradicting each other as to what pro-life really means, because they recognize that, oh, these tough cases, we probably need an exception for them. Indeed, not all pregnancies are the same. In rape and incest cases, she's been victimized enough already. Why victimize her even more by leaving her saddled with an unwanted abortion? I'm sorry, with an unwanted child. And then in cases of fetal deformity, we're talking a severely reduced quality of life. This child doesn't have the same access and opportunities that others would have. And abortion seems like a humane way to protect birth children from undue suffering. Also, pro-lifers tend to misrepresent the pro-choice position. The pro-choice position, which I'm arguing for, it should remain legal, but let's make sure we're not understanding pro-choice as pro-lifers tend to understand it. There's some critical distinctions to understand here. First, we all know abortion is ugly and offensive, but we don't live in utopia either. Contemporary abortion advocates recognize that we live in a complicated world where oftentimes you have to choose the lesser of two evils. And it's actually the more humane act many times to choose the lesser evil. In this case, committing or going through with an abortion. We don't live in utopia. We don't have an option where the mother is fully provided for and this child can be born. Many times that's just not an option. Also, it's a misnomer to say that pro-choicers are, quote, pro-abortion. You might have heard the summary statement, keep it rare, keep it safe, and keep it legal. Many pro-choicers are actually advocating for what they understand to be as the position which will reduce abortions as long as maternity is treated as women's destiny, then women will still have the societal impulse to keep having babies. And by the way, this is a very common opinion within the church. Women will still have the social pressure to be getting pregnant. And as long as abortion isn't available, then there's going to be a continued stream of unwanted pregnancies. If it's not available, then they'll be getting illegal abortions and oftentimes unsafe abortions. If it were kept legal, then these women can actually do something about it. So they're not saddled with 2, 3, 4, 5, 12 children just because they're sexually active. Many women, oftentimes they're going through with the right precautions to make sure they don't get pregnant, but the contraceptives aren't 100%. Again, we don't live in utopia. Pro-choice advocacy in the eyes of many pro-choicers is the best way to reduce abortions. We're giving women a safe and sanitary option rather than stigmatizing it and forcing women to endanger themselves. We aren't all radical or old school. Pro-choicers have grown a lot since some of the early days of abortion choice advocacy. Abortion on demand and without apology, that's the kind of mantra you could have heard Hillary Clinton or Bernie Sanders saying back in their college days. And that faction still exists today, but a lot of the pro-choice positioning today doesn't even like the terminology of pro-choice because that still has too much baggage with the radical positioning of the past. Many pro-choicers today are moderates, and they agree with term limits, that is, limiting abortion access after the first or second trimester. And many of them accept restrictions somewhat akin to European-style pro-choice positioning. And so there is a stronger moderating position that many pro-lifers are willing to grant. And as such, the conception of pro-choice positioning is far too homogenous and far too limited to represent the real options that are out there. And so that's my case for pro-choice. And just to remind anybody who's tuned in, I am not I'm not a pro-choice advocate myself. I am a pro-lifer, but I want to make sure that when pro-lifers are making their case for life, they're not swinging at a straw man. They're not misconstruing what the pro-choice position is, and they're using the best strategies, the best tactics, and potentially the greatest heart behind this, so that they're representing the most compassion of all parties involved. That's all I got. I do have some references I can leave for you. if anybody isn't planning on staying for the Q&A. All of the above pro-choice arguments and many more are thoroughly rebutted at my website, abortionhistorymuseum.wordpress.com. The second article, October 16, 2015, I've got links with, I think it's 40 pages, roughly 12 to 16 pages, and then roughly 9 to 12 pages worth of research notes on all of this. So there's a lot of resource material there. If you want to listen to real experts, though, Frank Beckwith has what I consider to be the best book for pro-life apologetic called Defending Life from 2009. Scott Klusendorf uses a person-centered model of arguments in The Case for Life in 2009. His is a top candidate for best book there. And then Randy Alcorn has probably the most comprehensive single text on this called Pro-Life Answers to Pro-Choice Arguments. His is a reference article, not reference article. It's a referential resource where you can look up according to the arguments. You can just flip straight to the kind of objection to page 327 and then see a few paragraphs responding to that particular argument. So it's well phrased for reference purposes. That's it. Questions?
Thanks, John. That was pretty excellent. Let me just say to everybody in the panel, if you want to ask a question, you're welcome to raise your hand, and I'll just promote you to panelist if you want to ask a specific question. I see there's 2 questions in the Q&A section, so let me just read that to you. Well, the one is more a statement I see from Vladimir. Vladimir, do you want to ask, read out your questions? I see you wrote quite an extensive question out here about, he basically wrote his question, what sort of a comparison is there between legislation of murder, which is abortion, and gun control? Should we revoke anti-murder laws since people will stand murder, will murder people regardless? If institutions like Planned Parenthood were closed down, hundreds of thousands of millions of lives would be saved. With gun control, lives are only lost and there are no comparison. Well, he's basically making and answering it himself. But what is your opinion, John? What do you think between the case or the analogy that there's sort of a comparison between the legislation of murder and abortion?
Well, a pro-choicer, if he's strategic, will call you on the carpet for assuming personhood without defending personhood, without establishing or proving personhood. Murder is illegal killing of a human being of a homicidal sort. Illegal killing of a human being could be, for example, self-defense under the right conditions. It could still be illegal, but it would be a relatively minor infraction because it was, even if you didn't follow procedure, the case might not really go very far and you won't get like murder in the first degree kind of treatment. Murder, for example, accidental manslaughter, that's a kind of illegal killing. But the punishment is relatively trivial when compared to, say, murder in the first degree, which in the U.S. is a capital offense, deserving of capital punishment. So if I were a strategic pro-choicer, I would call you on the carpet for implying that abortion is murder when you haven't proven that the child in utero is and child in utero, that's kind of my preferred term. I consider it more specifically referencing the fetus, because fetus technically doesn't start until like the 7th or 8th week. Before that, it's a zygote or embryo. So to call it a fetus is terminologically indistinct. Plus, horses and pigs have fetuses, but we're not talking about aborting horses. So child in utero is a little more specific terminology with reference to humans, but pro-choicers would never say child in utero, they'd say fetus. You need to prove that the fetus is a person. Now, gun rights have a constitutional basis that complicates the legal history of this. In the US, gun rights trace back to the Second Amendment, and gun right advocates will argue, you've got a whole backstory about defending your property. Yes, hunting's one use, but the primary purpose was so that you could organize militias, so that you could fight wars. And the chief threat in the early days was the government itself. There was a fear that some Georgian monarchy might have a relapse and say, yeah, let's go take America back. You know, let's reclaim America. Let's make America British again, to steal a Trumpism and misuse it. If they were to do that, that would be a horrible failure, because not only would they have to face organized militias, they'd have to face unorganized individuals who are just defending their property. And so that's a whole different backstory that makes the comparison a little disanalogous. Meanwhile, the history of women's rights suggests that sexism is gonna be sort of the default norm unless it's heavily fortified with lots of legal defenses and conscious community efforts to protect against subjugation of women. And abortion, as a pro-choicer would understand it, is one of those fortifications to make sure women have roughly equal access to the same privileges surrounding sex and pregnancy that men do. As a pro-lifer, I would say, and I'm switching here, that was my pro-choice answer. My pro-life answer would be the benefit of the doubt needs to go towards life. And even if we surrender the legal sense of murder, there remains an ethical sense of murder. That is unjustified killing of a human being. If something is unethical, it should not be done. If it's unethical to say a possum comes into your yard and it's a threat to your outdoor animals. You've got a pet cat, pet dog, and this possum might hurt your animals. You don't have an ethical right to capture this animal and string it up by its limbs and then slowly pull it apart, dismembering it, trying to cause as much suffering as possible. Now, you have a legal right to that. You can torture stray animals legally. It's horribly unethical, though. Yet our current abortion policy doesn't just make it legal to terminate a pregnancy. It makes it legal to tear apart a child in utero, limb from limb, till you eventually put in the medical tweezers and crush its skull and then pull the remaining carcass out. And then you stick a medical vacuum up and then you suck out all the remains. And then you have to reassemble it roughly on a platter to make sure you got all the parts. So it's a horrific, barbaric procedure. Now, I'm talking about late first trimester to second and third trimester abortions. Earlier ones don't necessarily have that same procedure. Is it ethical to do that to a human being? And biologically, there's no debate about it. It's humanity. I avoid the personhood debate where I can. I think it can be won. I think we can establish it sufficient for a pro-life case, but to prevent getting stuck on that rabbit trail, I just say it's a human being. It is human. Are you denying? Do you think she's going to give birth to a giraffe? It's a human. It's a human fetus, is it not? And is it ethical to tear apart a human fetus limb from limb? And they might try to say, yes, it's okay. But usually they try to back up and realize that they're advocating for brutality and they want to try a different tactic. So the murder issue, I would say, yes, you can press it, but make sure you distinguish between legal murder versus ethical murder. Ethical murder is just unethical killing of a human being.
Very good. I don't see anybody's hands up, nor do I see anybody sending through questions, but I have a question.
Okay.
Sort of the Hippocratic Creed, you know that there's sort of a section in there, and I just want to read it to you. It says the following. It says, I will neither give a deadly drug to anyone if asked for, nor will I make a suggestion to this effect. similarly, I will not give to a woman an abortive remedy. How can you can you make a case sort of from a medical perspective that ethically, medically, if you took a Hippocratic Creed or sort of a creed, specifically as a doctor, that you do not have the right, is there any basis for that creed to stand and to advocate sort of the idea for a abortion from a medical perspective without getting involved sort of in a religious setting?
I'll answer it as a pro-choicer and then as a pro-lifer. As a pro-choicer, I would say, if I were a pro-choicer, I would say ancient laws are for ancient people. The ancient law that you just described is the old form of the Hippocratic Oath, not the updated modern one, which accommodates abortion choice. The old law probably made good sense given the medical practices of the time. If you're going to go back to Hippocrates' time of the BC era, well, they were just kind of spitballing it. I mean, they were going blind. I mean, at the time, it was still not allowed to do autopsies, so they really didn't understand how the human body worked. They were working on a four humors understanding of human health, and so oftentimes what they did was they would prescribe potions that were concoctions that were to take the woman almost to the brink of death, so that anything in her would die. And hopefully it's not so far that she dies too. So of course Hippocrates was going to say, don't prescribe abortions because you're going to be raising your maternal mortality rate by doing so. And she's your patient. A pro-choicer could also say that the International Council on Human Rights stands firmly, overwhelmingly on the side of pro-choice positioning. They consider it one of these modern liberal progressive vindications of civilization. This is proof that you're entering the first world as a country, and there is an inordinately high correlation between third world countries and back alley abortion rates, maternal deaths, medical complications that they don't treat correctly, and the women die, and women get forced into back alley abortions because the imam didn't want it to get out that he was in an affair and things like that. So this global picture of abortion can kind of weaken that case a little bit. Now that's what a pro-choicer might say. As a pro-lifer, speaking as a pro-lifer, I should say, I generally avoid the religious case when I'm making my pro-life argument. While I celebrate that there's lots of groups out there that are getting involved, and I really think that the church, if it were to wake up on this issue and have a collective unified voice, have solidarity on this issue, we could abolish abortion tomorrow. Yeah. I mean, we could abolish it in short order if the church cared enough, if the church was willing to inconvenience themselves enough to bolster the adoption agencies, to do the baby showers, to take in unwed mothers, to really get behind the stuff that they're talking about. If the church really did that, I think this could be done in short order. That said, I think at the academic level, where a lot of this debate is still very hot, it's not necessarily where most of the lives are won and lost, but it's still where a lot of the debate happens at an academic level. It's really important that we don't saddle the pro-life case with a bunch of religious commitments that aren't necessary. I'm this way when it comes to Christian apologetics too. I'm not a presuppositionalist because I don't want to saddle this discussion with a whole bunch of assumptions that I say, okay, you're going to have to believe in inerrancy, you're going to have to believe in the Trinity, you're going to have to ascribe to monotheism before we can even have a conversation here. And that just seems standoffish and unnecessary. And I've been in too many debates to want to have a lot of extra battles to fight.
Yeah, for sure.
Here, I focus my argument on the burden of proof. I say, if you're advocating for a legal right to kill a human being, then we have prima facie, we have justified cause to consider that as potentially murder, unethical killing of a human being. And lest we commit murder by policy, federal policy, lest we commit murder, you need to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that it's not unethical killing, that it's not murder. And I'm all ears. Let's hear you.
Yeah.
And do you see what I did? I shifted the burden to them. And I said, we're going to give, if we don't know, we don't shoot. If I'm on a hunting trip, I'm going to use Ronald Reagan's famous analogy. If you're on a hunting trip with a friend and, a few hours in, you notice that there's a rustle in the bush, do you just shoot? It might be a deer, but it might also be your hunting partner. If you don't know, don't shoot. If it might be murder, then you need to be sure that it's not before you wave the green flag and approve of killing whatever that thing is. I also would add that let's say we can't ever prove that it's a person. I can surrender personhood like that and still say that you're still destroying a human individual. You're still inflicting harm on a human individual. You're still stealing the entire future, including all choices that individual would ever make. You're taking it from that child who presumably has a greater right to that future than you do, especially since you can't use it. You can only destroy it. Only that child can use its future. You can't. Moreover, let's say we can't even get a person to agree that it's human. Is it an animal? Okay, yes, it's an animal. It's alive in that sense. Well, I can't go pull your pet dog apart limb from limb and then crush its skull, can I?
Sure. Well,
animal abuse is still just cause for banning abortion. We could also say death profiteering. Death profiteering is a bad practice. We don't want to incentivize institutions that survive entirely by killing human beings. Well, forget personhood for a second. We're allowing incentivized killing of human beings, and that seems like a very dangerous practice.
Yeah.
So there's a couple different ways that we can expose, we can lift the lid off of abortion and show just what they're talking about, just what it is that they're fighting for. You're fighting for the ability to mutilate the most defenseless members of the human race. And once you do that, oftentimes folks won't defend it. They just turn around and say, well, you pro-lifers this, you pro-lifers that. I'm like, call me whatever you want. As long as we can agree that this thing in the woman who's pregnant, her literal child in utero, a literal human being, a literal member of the human race, as long as you're willing to grant that it's a travesty that this thing, by federal permission, can be killed.
Very good. John, can you just stop sharing the screen, I think, for the recording, otherwise it's not going to pick up the picture.
Let's see, how do I do that?
We'll probably put you back on. Sort of.
Not sure how to do that. How do I do that? Do you know how to do that?
I just now have to stop my own video. But
stop share.
You got it. Sure. Okay. Yes, I'm gonna just ask Jason. Jason is basically also just to ask a question. So let me just unmute him.
Okay.
Hello.
Hey, Jason.
Hey, I just had a couple of questions, I guess, for your pro-choice persona here.
Where are you calling from first? I'm from Iowa, by the way.
Oh, hi. I'm from Little Rock, Arkansas.
Okay.
So on the charge that pro-life is hypocritical, in regards to the being pro-life and pro-capital punishment,
okay.
My response would be that the distinction is in innocent human life. That that the fetus or person in the womb, whatever you want to call it, that there's no justification for killing it because it hasn't done anything yet, despite maybe the name calling of a parasite or whatever. But there's nothing deserving of a death penalty, which is what we're giving it with an abortion. Whereas with capital punishment, there has been a crime committed and finding of guilt by a jury of their peers and so on. And so that would be, I guess I got like three questions here. On that would be 1 point, and on the pro-life.
Wait, was there a question there or was it a comment?
Well, that would be, I guess, my answer to that charge of hypocrisy.
Mm-hmm.
And then I was maybe wondering what the pro-choice response to that would be, because
It's in my experience. Just to respond to the first one, because if you give me 3 questions, I'll lose track of all.
Okay.
I'll respond to that one, and then we'll hear your second question.
Okay.
As a pro-lifer myself, I had to bite my tongue in writing that one because it seems like the obvious distinction is moral guilt, legal guilt. If a person has taken a human life, for example, a capital punishment is at least theoretically suited to them. Now, there's a lot of countries that don't believe in capital punishment. They think we're evolved past that. Whatever. Even those countries can recognize that it's at least justice. It's not unjust to issue a capital punishment for grievous crimes like that. They just don't necessarily, or on the whole, they just don't necessarily think that we have to do that. It might be ethically superior to extend grace or mercy as long as we can afford to keep them in prison for life or something like that. So that's how one person could respond to it. I do agree that the critical distinction is moral or ethical guilt. I'm sorry, moral or legal guilt. The pro-choicer, in my experience, doesn't have a great response to that. I found they tend to attack me personally or try to change the subject a little bit because essentially you've got, like, let's say you generalize this much. You say, I've got this example, and I'm going to draw a circle around here, and that's going to be my generalization circle. So religion is the cause of all terror in the world. Well, which religion? Religion is. I'm not shrinking the circle. I want this circle to be as wide as suits my purposes. You're pro-life. That means you don't think any human being should die even in cases of grievous crimes. I'm not going to shrink my circle. And so your challenge then is to identify that generalization as conveniently broad and fallaciously broad. If they're not willing to admit what appears to be an obvious and critical distinction in that, then they need to give just cause for not allowing that distinction. And so to clarify it, just say, okay, if you're not going to allow this distinction, why? Give me a better reason than I have for keeping that distinction in play. And if they don't have one, then you might have actually given them a good reason to start doubting a part of their positioning. Okay, does that help?
Yeah, that's kind of what I'd run into too, is just in talking to abortion supporters online. When I made that distinction, they just resorted to name calling.
Abortion choice supporters. A lot of big distinction. They'll feel insulted and then they'll derail and say, "You don't even understand what we're saying. Have you been listening? Who are you? You hate women." And then you don't get anything done. Abortion choice is fine. The women should have the choice, but folks oftentimes say we need to educate them so that they don't even use that option. They don't go there. We don't want more abortions, but we want women to have that choice. All right.
All right. So I guess next point or question would be on the pro-life versus rape or incest cases, the hard cases.
Yeah.
My view on that is it seems like the abortion is punishing the wrong person. You're giving the baby or the fetus the death penalty for a crime committed by the father, the rapist, or the incest.
Agreed.
The incestuous person. So there again, it kind of comes back to that moral guilt thing, and it's like, well, I know it's not what people want to hear, that the woman should carry through with this childbirth, that she didn't ask for, that she didn't want, that all of that, but it still seems there's this logical discrepancy here in that we're punishing someone that had no say in the matter, and not punishing the person that actually did commit the crime. And I just wondered what a pro-abortion choice response to that would be.
A pro-choicer, in my experience, recognizes they've got the most emotionally powerful part of their argument centering on rape cases, because no one wants to come off like they're making it hard for rape victims. No one wants to look like they're making things even harder for a rapist or someone who's got the prospect of a deformed child. Everybody wants to find a compassionate solution for them, pro-choicer and pro-lifer. When it comes to rape cases, and even incest cases, and even fetal deformities, here's one track that I've recently started to implement. There were state accommodations for all of those before Roe versus Wade. And so when the pro-choicer brings up these exceptional cases, which only account for 2 to 3% of all abortions, ask them, would you approve of repealing Roe versus Wade so long as these exceptions were in place? So by questioning, you let them answer, because people love to talk. You can let them do the talking, and quite possibly what you'll find is they'll say, no, that's not the real reason. They're using a fake reason that doesn't actually constitute the support for their position. The real support for their position is elsewhere. And I think the reason why abortion choice remains as strong as it is sex. Ultimately, people want sex without consequences. They want pleasure without responsibility. And I would say that abortion choice fosters more exploitation of women. It accommodates rapists by destroying evidence, by silencing witnesses, and by facilitating his continued practice of rape, because the last victim was able to just shut up about it and not have to bring it up again. And that accommodates rapists. I think you're very right that it's punishing the wrong victim. I think we should not issue a capital punishment or the equivalent thereof without reasonable certainty of their guilt or deserving that sort of act. And if we don't have reasonable certainty that is beyond a reasonable doubt, then we shouldn't issue it, even in cases of rape. Now, this is very, very hard to say regarding rape victims, but we have to admit, first and foremost, there's no easy options. Some pig forced on her an unwanted pregnancy. Some pig potentially robbed her of her virginity, robbed her of her safety, her security, some of the psychological well-being, the potential to be able to trust men the same way in the future. Some guy stole that from her. And I'm all for throwing the book at him. Let's punish him to the fullest extent of the law. Or we could even revisit harsher laws against them. Let's see, maybe we're being too easy on them. Indeed, I think we are being too easy on them oftentimes. I don't know if you're familiar with the Stanford rape case. This one guy, he was attempting to rape a girl who was passed out, half naked or fully naked, I don't remember. Apparently she had been drinking too much. Given how long it took her to wake up, I wonder if she had been drugged, but I don't know that there's any verified proof of that. But he was attempting to rape her like on the lawn outside of essentially a frat party. What's that? It was behind a dumpster. It was outside. And two guys that were riding their bicycles on a street out there were able to see him, and they stopped him. And I think the story is that he didn't actually penetrate, but he had already gotten, it was an attempted, he was convicted of 3 sexual assault counts, 3 different kinds, each of which merited a 2-year sentence, minimum. Max was like 6 years or more, or 5 years. So he should have gotten, with the 3-fold conviction that he should have gotten between 6 and I think 15 years. The judge looked at that and said, well, he's probably not going to do it again, and this will hurt his record, so he let him off with 6 months, even though the minimum should have been 6 years. Now, I consider that a travesty of justice. Now, as a pro-lifer, I think it's really, really important to take seriously the classic feminist causes, regardless of what feminism has come to mean today. You kind of have to ignore a lot of the shrill parts of the debate that aren't very productive. But the classic issues of women's rights, oftentimes, if we don't show how much we care about those, then we don't have a voice regarding abortion. And so I'd say aborting in the case of rape and incest, it adds trauma, it accommodates rapists, and it accommodates molesters, and it displaces injustice. It doesn't fix injustice.
Yeah, for sure.
Justice fixes injustice, not more injustice. You can't kill someone to get justice on a rapist. No, maybe kill the rapist, but not the second victim of the rape. Mm-hmm. And so I think the ethics of it are all wrong, but the heart behind it is critically important. We have to demonstrate that our heart's in the right place, that we have right compassion, that we aren't trying to diminish her suffering. We're trying to keep it from spreading. Mm-hmm. So we want to help the rapist get caught. And that means we're not destroying evidence and we're not accommodating silence where we can help it. Now, she might not be able to handle it. If she can't handle it and she won't take it to trial, you can't make her. But our voice needs to be that of loving husbands and loving fathers and brothers and male friends, speaking as guys here, lending strength so that she knows that she's safe, she's secure, she can make it through this to bring this trash to justice.
Yes, very good.
And when it comes to fetal deformity, tell that to someone who's born and has a deformity. But a lot of the pro-choice arguments work just as well for infanticide or euthanasia. And rather than go all there, I'll just say there's a parallel there that we could address more starkly by critiquing eugenics and critiquing euthanasia.
Okay, thank you. And last question on a recent debate, the person I was talking with brought up the 14th Amendment. Mm-hmm. And so I quoted the 14th Amendment in my response. Mm-hmm. And of course their response was, well, you're not a constitutional scholar. So, I'm like, well, I can still read it though, but it says on here, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. And my case was, and I guess you might say that I was assuming personhood to do this, but would this be a legitimate argument to say that the 14th Amendment that's often used to justify abortion should actually be justifying pro-life position, because we are effectively denying to the baby the equal protection of the law when we take its life like that?
It should be the case, but it's not. And by legal precedent, it won't be within the foreseeable future. We would need some sort of drastic legal stance that would overturn Roe v. Wade, or would add some new amendment that clarifies that fetal humans are fetal persons. There is a bit of a constitutional Declaration of Independence case that can be made. If you go back to the Declaration of Independence, where it says, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Now that word men, by many arguments, means person. And it at least means person, but it might mean more than that too. The legal history of human rights legislation has been a testimony of expansion. What counts as a human being? Are black people human beings, slaves? What about people from other ethnicities? Can we do this with war prisoners? Can we treat as inhuman people who are enemy combatants, and so Geneva Rights Conventions and American recognition of those kinds of things? What about women? It says all men are created equal, but surely not women, right? And so the history of human rights legislation has been one of expansion to include more. But when we came to Roe v. Wade, there was a turn. Instead of becoming inclusive, trying to bring more and more people into the protectable domain of rights-bearing citizens and rights-bearing individuals, it retracted and said, hold on, we have here a potential human. And in the Roe v. Wade decision, I think Justice Blackmun was very keenly aware of the wording in the 14th Amendment. He understood what was at stake here, and he understood that if he called this thing a human, then personhood would follow. So he based his legal decision on a nuanced understanding of humanity that did not grant conception, did not grant a conception definition, which biologically, even at that time, he should have known better. Biologically, we knew, at least in 71, 72, and we've got documents to support this within the medical community, it was considered common knowledge within the medical community that a human life begins at conception, a distinct one, not just a dependent parasite or something, but a distinct human life. He should have known better, but he also knew that if he admitted a distinct human life beginning at conception, and I'm going to tie this back into the Declaration of Independence in a second, if he granted that, then personhood would follow, and then all these rights guaranteed to legal persons would follow. So he said it's only a potential human. A potential human. Scientifically, that's inept. He should have known better, and I think we should continue to beat that horse. I think we should attack that. We should say science is on our side. It's a human. Roe v. Wade was based on bad science. Now, why does this matter? Because we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Well, what's the point of creation? Conception. Equality begins at conception, according to the Declaration of Independence, which is even more basic than the Constitution, and even more basic than the amendments, than the Bill of Rights. And so if we can establish that equality begins at the creation of a human individual, then we have established that legal right should follow, because this human is no less or no more human than you are. And we recognize that female humans, African-American humans, small humans, minority rights, by minors I mean underage. There was a child's rights revolution that we had around the same time as women's rights. And so I think we've got a case that can be made. You can also argue from international declarations such as the Human Rights Declaration, which, even though the international councils tend to side roughly in favor of abortion, you can usually find points where they admit human, or they admit something that prevents, for example, gender-based abortion. It's currently legal to abort a baby because it's black and you don't like black people. If you got drunk and you didn't realize that guy was half black and you got pregnant and it's a black baby inside of you, it's a quarter African American, you can legally kill that human being because of its race. You can also legally kill that human being because it's female and you want a boy baby, you don't want a girl baby. So the human rights revolution has had a serious retraction, I think, when it comes to abortion choice. And I think we need to be hammering that, because abortion choice advocates think they have the moral high ground. They think they're the advocates for social justice. But what they're advocating for is displaced social injustice. Take injustice from this woman and put it on someone who's even more silent, who can't nag you about it, and put it on someone who is even more defenseless, who can't even hit back.
Yeah. Now, a tag along on that 14th Amendment question, would the last time I checked, about I think half the states, maybe a little more than half, would charge a person that that killed a woman that was pregnant. They would charge him with a double homicide. So they're counting that fetus as a person in that case, capable of being murdered. And from what I've read, a lot of those states specifically exempt abortion from that, because the obvious extension of that would be that, well, if you kill the woman and kill the baby inside her at the same time and it's a double homicide, well, then why is it not a homicide when the abortion doctor does it? So they specifically exempt it. But the fact that we still have over half the states considering the baby a person in that case of the mother being either killed or injured so that the baby dies, if they're considering it a person at that point to charge the person with murder, would that be a way to say, okay, practically speaking, the 14th Amendment is talking about persons. Practically speaking, half the country considers this baby a person because we charge somebody with murder for killing them.
Yeah, I think there's a possible pro-life case that could be developed from that legal precedent. You're referring to the Unborn Victims of Violence Act. I think that was 2001. It's also called the Lacey and Connor Law. That's a very significant court precedent that I think in many ways bodes well for pro-lifers, because it points out that you've got an inconsistency, or at least a problematic explanatory point, when an individual's personhood is literally contingent on another person's choice. That seems like an arbitrary distinction. Regardless of how we resolve personhood doesn't seem like the kind of thing that another person can decide for you. Another person can decide for this human whether they're a person or not. No, if that person's a person, they are that regardless of anyone else's opinion, mother, father, whatever. And so you've got a potential inconsistency there. Now, I think there might be a way that a pro-choicer could rebut that, saying they're not granting personhood, they're granting a certain legal right as if it were a person. And because of the unusual circumstance, they have to grant, because they are so pro-choice, that's the mother's choice to make. It's no one else's choice to make. A thief can't come up to a woman and punch her in the pregnant belly and kill it and then say, well, you're going to an abortion clinic anyway. No. Even if she was walking to an abortion clinic, if he kills it, it wasn't his right to kill it. It was her right to have it done. And so since he was exercising a right that wasn't his, he's still committing a criminal act. And so that's a distinction there. A pro-choicer might also say you're still dealing with rare cases. You're trying to absolutize or universalize over exceptional cases. And pro-lifers would say, hey, that's our rebuttal when you try to absolutize liberal pro-choice policy on the basis of rape cases. It's only like 1%. So there's a rebuttal that can be made, but I think the key values for the Lacey and Connor Law are inconsistency on the subject of personhood, and I think we can utilize that. Another benefit of it is it instituted for legal precedent a technical phrase that I use all the time. A human, what's the term? I'm losing it right now. Human in utero, a child in utero, fetus in utero. When you refer to this individual human being as a child in utero, you're starting to win the battle. You're starting to win the battle because a great deal of the abortion debate is framed in euphemisms that favor the pro-choice side. We have to keep consciously peeling away the euphemisms so that we're talking about the same thing. Because they may think that they're talking about a fetus, but what they're actually talking about is a zygote. What they think they're talking about as a tumor is actually a differentiated organism and therefore not a tumor. If they're talking about a tumor, yes, kill the tumor. Tumors are bad. Let's get rid of tumors. But there's never been a baby that's a tumor. There's never been a child in utero that's a tumor. They may think they're arguing for women's rights, or I'll say for female rights, but they're actually arguing for the legal destruction of roughly 500,000 females yearly. You're not exactly being a very consistent feminist if you're advocating for the willful destruction of innocent female lives on the order of 500,000 yearly. And so our effort needs to be peeling back the euphemisms and keep restating what they're actually arguing for, so they have to face up into the mirror what they're saying. Not just what it sounds like to them, but what it is. What is abortion? Many of them have never even thought about what goes into an abortion. And it's scandalous to think about what's actually happening.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Thanks.
All right. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jason. Okay, Scott, let me just unmute Scott. John, Scott has got a question for you.
Hello, Scott.
Hi, Don. Can you hear me?
Yes, barely.
Oh, sorry about that. It's a new microphone. So my camera's not on. It's not working for some strange reason. So
I trust that you're still a beautiful person.
Thank you. And I wanted to say thank you for coming out and talking to us today. I'm a little disappointed that Beth is not here, not because you're chopped liver, but because it's one thing to talk to a friend about these things, and another to have someone actually disagree with you violently.
Yeah.
All right, so I'm having trouble understanding this concept of what is a person.
Agreed.
And how is that different from a human being. What are the criteria and what are the requirements for this personhood?
There's no universal acceptance as to what constitutes a person. I myself philosophically am a Thomist. That means I favor the teachings of Thomas Aquinas. I grant a lot of the classical definition of personhood as an individual conscious being which has volition, that is will, free will even, mind, and emotion. Not necessarily passion. There's a whole theological debate about that. I'll leave that alone for a second. But this way, God can have personhood without a body. Angels can have personhood without a body. Human beings can have personhood. Now, that said, I don't expect this definition of personhood to win out in the court system. I don't expect it to win out and resolve even the philosophical disputes about what constitutes personhood. Can robots be persons and so on? It gets really messy really quick. Legally speaking, when we're talking about personhood, and you can look this up and get a better definition from the legal dictionaries like Black's Law Dictionary. You can get, I think, the fifth edition free online to look up any of this stuff. But I think legally what we're talking about is a human rights-bearing individual. A human rights-bearing individual. What qualifies them as that? That's the whole problem. Depending on the country, you'll get a different understanding of it. A human rights-bearing individual. Again, that's also laden with the notion of human rights, but that's considered accepted terminology in the U.S. at least. We are a human rights governance, and we recognize certain rights that are just beneath dispute. Perhaps they're intrinsic to individuals. Perhaps they're intrinsic to all human beings. but somehow they are beneath dispute, and we have agreed, at least by convention, to accept that all these humans have whatever these rights are. And they include the rights to life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, and property. And built off of that, we've got other civil rights. Personhood is the proper location for those things. Legal personhood is the proper location for those things to start applying. Civil rights start to break down a little bit in terms of age and location and certain things. Like you might have some civil rights available to you at a state level that you don't have elsewhere. Civil rights regarding liberty and gun ownership, say in Washington, D.C. versus central Georgia. One will have a very strictly regulated gun policy, and the other might have pretty much a Western free-for-all. I exaggerate, but you get my point. So that's legal personhood, and that's also a little distinct from the philosophical sense of personhood. I try to avoid those terms in part because, number one, I'm not a legal scholar. I would need to develop a little bit more in that area so that I know I'm speaking with good precision there. But philosophically, that's just not going to resolve anytime in the near future. I think that's a rabbit trail, and I don't think that's overall productive. I do think we can use personhood in this way by shifting the burden of proof to say, prove that it's not a person in any relevant sense that should be recognized by the law in terms of granting it the benefit of the doubt. You prove that. I don't have to prove that it's a person. All I need is agnosticism on it. As long as we're not sure, as long as there's reasonable doubt, then we should not pass a death penalty against that thing. Because all we need is reasonable doubt. Now, human being is a biological term. That's critically important. And I have had pro-choicers try to haggle with me on this. And I'm like, look, don't get mad at me. Get mad at modern science. That's not my beef. Your beef is with science. Science has already concluded that conception is where is the earliest stage of development for the whole course of a human individual, all the way through the geriatric years and death. Conception is where two distinct genetic codes combine and form an autonomous organism, self-directed, with its own unique history that's different from its mother. It will have a different blood type. It can have a different blood type, different hair color, different gender. When it starts to develop a little bit, it'll have separate arms and legs from its mother. The person who says, my body, my right. Well, I'm sorry, ma'am, but I don't think you have 4 legs, 4 arms, 2 heads, 2 hearts, and so on. It's in your body, but it's not your body. And this is something unique. Men don't have this. Women have this, but still, it's not your body. It's just in your body. But what is it? Well, it's of the genus and species Homo sapiens. It's not a horse. It's not a pig. It's not a tree. It's a Homo sapiens. And the literal nomenclature for members of the Homo sapiens species is human being. It's not just adjectival sense of human, like human hair or human skin. It's a human. It's a human being. Now, some folks have disputed with me about the use of human being because we also use the word human being to mean person or adult or something like that. And yes, there's that usage, but I'm not using it that way. I'm using it to refer to a being that is human, an individual, distinct entity that is an organism. It's not a tumor. It's not an organ. It's not an organelle, like a sperm or egg. It's a zygote, embryo, then fetus, and then once it's born, it goes through all the other stages of development of its own distinct human being. Another important thing that helps establish that it's still a human being, it's not like a series, is that at no point does the entity die and get replaced by something. It's not like the zygote dies and is replaced by a fetus. No, the zygote keeps living, and when it reaches a certain stage of development, we call it a fetus. When it reaches a certain stage of development and birth, we call it a newborn. We would call it a neonatal infant or adolescent or adult. These are descriptions of the same individual over the course of its life. Now, this biological continuity is an argument that can be used for personhood, but it's at least a defense that we're talking about a singular human being, not just an unspecified entity that happens to have human cells. No, it's a human being. So does that help clarify person versus human?
Yes, I understand the distinction that you're making. However, I think that when we're talking about the unborn person or the unborn human, it's enough to say that it's a human being, and by being a human being, it has a right to life. I don't think any additional personhood is needed to establish that it has a right to life.
Agreed. I phrase it as, I'll bring up the term human rights, and sometimes I'll phrase it as a question saying, how human must a human be to have human rights? Because human rights seems to predicate on humanity. If they're denying the concept of human rights, then I'd say, give me an alternative term so I can properly understand what you're saying. Because I'm talking about human rights. What are you talking about? Are you talking about person rights? Okay, that's fine. You defend your person rights. I'm going to defend human rights. And they don't want to play that game. Oftentimes they feel like they're being pulled in a direction they don't want to go, but their metaphysical commitments have already tied them in that direction. They have already stepped away from human rights as such and started to add things besides humanity before those rights apply. They're talking about person rights, not just human rights.
Right, and it seems like this idea of personhood, the way they use it, is a kind of a canard to disregard the personhood of the unborn people. Mm-hmm. Just as in the days of slavery, you would have said, or somebody would have said that people who are from Africa don't have personhood. Yes, maybe they're human beings, but they don't have personhood. Therefore, it's okay to enslave them.
Yep.
All right, moving on.
And by the way, that drives pro-choicers up the wall. They hate the slavery comparison. In my experience, it's still very valuable, but it has to be approached carefully. And it might be something to use maybe in your second or third volley of arguments if they've started to trust your academic integrity first. If they start to trust your academic integrity first, and maybe they made a concession or two, you can start using the language of justice to show how abortion treats a human being as disposable property that can be killed at will. We have a precedent of that in U.S. history, but it's a pretty shameful precedent. Are you aware that you're aligning with a very bleak chapter in U.S. history where we enslaved human beings and treated them as property? That's currently what abortion choice does for another class of human beings.
Yep, agreed. Okay, so my second question here was regarding the legal situation. You gave your talk, and it was called 10 Reasons We Should Keep Abortion Legal. One thing I've always wanted to ask as a pro-choice person is, what law makes abortion legal in this country?
What law?
What law?
14th Amendment would be, and incidentally, it doesn't explicitly, by the Roe v. Wade interpretation, it doesn't explicitly clarify personhood for the fetus, but it does clarify the rights and privileges at a civil and human rights level for all persons, including mothers. And the right to privacy, as it's understood, is implicit within the rights of life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. Those can't be. A woman can't be separated from those without due process. And the due process was the Roe v. Wade case and subsequent cases, Doe v. Bolton and so on, which tried to establish how does privacy play out. Now, a lot of pro-lifers take a stark approach to right to privacy, and they say that's not a right, and that's not a real privilege. And I'm like, I don't want to say that, because homeschooling is legal on the basis of a right to privacy. You have a right to raise your children how you see fit. That's a right of privacy. You have a right to cook food how you want. You don't have a government agency coming in and saying, I'm sorry, you're putting too much oil in that food, it's unhealthy. No, your right to privacy entails a privilege to cook your own food how you see fit. And if you want to triple fry a fajito burger, then you can do that, no matter how unhealthy it is, because it's broadly encased within your right of privacy. So the right of privacy isn't my issue. The application of the right of privacy to the point of destroying a human being seems an obvious overstep. All rights are bounded. The only circumstance where people are totally unbounded, they have universal, unambiguous, total rights and freedoms, well, that's anarchy. That's not liberty. That's when people can do whatever they want. They can kill other human beings. But we recognize that obviously that's absurd. We don't mean anarchy, we mean liberty. Well, what are the bounds to established rights? For example, I have the right to swing my arm. I can swing my arm however I want, except when it ends at your nose. The right to swing my arm ends at your nose, because then it's assault. And whenever we're talking about a right that is extended so far as to harm other human beings, we've got a natural limit to that right. And I think that's the case with every one of our rights.
Yes, I agree with you. The question, what I was asking, or the reason I was asking it is because I think if I were to say to someone that I just met on the street and was having this debate with what law makes abortion legal, they reflexively say Roe v. Wade. I'd say, oh, no, wait, that's a court case. Courts don't make laws. You need an act of Congress. The legislature is the only one that makes laws. And then I would ask them, so what law? And I imagine most people probably don't know that the decision in Roe v. Wade was based on the 14th Amendment and the right to privacy. Yeah. And then I would point out that, just because if we can establish that the unborn is a human being, then you don't have the right to murder it in private any more than I have the right to murder you, this person I'm talking to. If it's done in private, then it's okay.
I think it's a good line of thought, good line of argument there.
All right, one last thing before I leave.
Private evil is still evil. Mm-hmm.
Yes, exactly. Regarding the name that appears on your video screen, I had trouble with this myself until I got myself a free Zoom account. Once you have a Zoom account and you log into Zoom, it will recognize.
Yeah. I did that. I logged in as myself, and it came up as this name.
Oh, that's freaky.
Yeah, I
thought that might help.
Maybe I'll find someone with enough technical prowess to kind of walk me through and see what I did wrong. Maybe we can take this question up off the air or something. And
all right. Well, thanks for answering my questions.
And figure it out that way.
Okay. God bless you.
Hope it helps.
Yes. Thanks. God bless.
Excellent. It seems like, John, it just seems like everybody's basically going off. So if you have anything to add, you're welcome to. Or if anybody else wants to ask a question, they're also welcome to. We've got 6 people in the room. So if you have anything you want to add as sort of a closing remark, you're also welcome to do that, John.
Thanks. I think it's important for Christians to challenge their churches to really step up on this, because the scope of it, we're just numb to it. We just don't think about what we're talking about here. We don't seriously consider this issue. We're kind of, it's like sometimes a movie will come out that's themed on, say, Civil War era slavery in the U.S., and a lot of us are just, again, good grief, just beating us up over this. Come on, the Civil War's over, get over it. And folks can just be kind of numb about it, because it feels like they're like, feel bad, feel guilty. Come on, you need to feel more guilty than you are. Feel guilty. And the effect is it kind of hurts the overall case. because that is in the past. And granted, there's probably a long history of recovery, generational recuperation still necessary. And this is probably way more fresh in South Africa, but you can probably still relate. Folks who almost don't want to get out of the past because they were most entitled in the past, or they were most offended by what happened there. And that stuff hasn't fully resolved. That hasn't been totally fixed. But if there's even a process of closure underway, then you can't necessarily make it go faster, and you can't necessarily force people to feel a certain way till they start acting on it. You can have the opposite effect. And when it comes to abortion, I think a lot of folks, they were zealous in college, or they did the marches, or they picketed an abortion clinic or two, and they've kind of fallen off the map. They say, well, we lost a few and it's just over. I think times are changing, though. I think we need to, number one, remember what's at stake here. We are, just in the US, we're talking about a death toll that is 10 times more than the Holocaust. 10 times more than the Holocaust, almost 10 times. We're at about 59 million, and the Holocaust was right at about 6 million. We're talking about a global count that is well over 1 billion globally. We're talking about what is literally the most deadly events in all of human history, in all of the history of the world, shy of maybe animal extinction events. I mean, this is literally more death toll than even the Great Flood had that happened. Like, I believe in the Great Flood, but even people who don't believe in it, if that had happened, we're still talking about less than 1 billion, more like probably 300 million total on the planet. So we're talking about gargantuan numbers in our time, and we want to think that we've somehow evolved in terms of our human rights legislation, involved in terms of our civil rights and so on. Hogwash. We are currently abiding the institutionalized destruction of more lives than we saw in the Black Plague, than we saw in the Crusades, than we saw in the Inquisition, than we saw in World War I, than we saw in World War II, than we saw in the Holocaust, than we saw in the Bolshevik Revolution. We are talking about the current most deadly thing ever, and it's going on right under our noses, and people are scared that they might offend someone. And do you see how, in perspective, this is just ridiculous? And so I think we need to be having coffee with our pastor saying, why aren't we more pro-life on this? Is there something more we can be doing? Can I start a club? Can we get a discussion group going? What can we do? I think if the church is mobilized, and the churches are God's ordained hand on earth, oftentimes we totally misuse that. But if we could use that blessing in the right direction, I think we can see some of the power of God on earth. That means legislative challenges. That means continuing to bring up court cases, to be arguing these things well. That means regarding contraceptives that have a potential abortifacient aspect, we need to be taking that seriously, getting informed. We need to be preaching and teaching this from the pulpits. We need to be preaching and teaching it in the classrooms. We need to be establishing it, and not by straw man presenting the pro-choice case. I think we need to give them the best possible case they can, because frankly, I don't think we'll win if we have to misrepresent the opponent, because we're going to lose our ethical high ground. We lose our integrity if the only way we can win is by cheating. I think the pro-life case, argument-wise, is open and shut. We have a better case here than most any other topic in Christian apologetics. It is open and shut. It's overloaded with rabbit trails, with ad hominems, with misunderstandings, willful misunderstandings oftentimes. And when we just cut through that and we peel back the euphemisms and say, so let me get this straight, you're arguing for a right for a mother to kill her boy or girl as long as it's in its most defenseless state by pulling its limbs apart and crushing its skull and sucking it out of the womb. You're arguing for that as a right, even if that's girls that are being killed. I didn't say anything dishonest there. I just recapped what they're arguing for. And many times, once they have to look at it without the pretty sheen of euphemisms, they don't want to look at it. Now, they won't necessarily convert to pro-life, but quite often what they will do is they'll back off. They won't have an abortion themselves. They won't argue for pro-choice. They won't support it. And you have disempowered the pro-choice argument by one more person. That's a win. That's a victory. And that, I think, is what we can and should be arguing for. And I think raising up our kids, conducting ourselves in ways that aren't ever going to generate unplanned pregnancies that we can't handle. You know, it's one thing if a husband and wife have an oopsie, but it's another thing if you know your 14-year-old daughter has an oopsie. At a church level, I think we can earn credibility by taking seriously the privilege of adoption. This is hard. My wife and I, we don't have kids. We don't say this lightly. We recognize this is a challenge to us too. We need to always be considering, can we support a child? Are we willing to? Are we able? And be trying to stretch so that we can do our part to take care of single mothers, to take care of unwanted babies, to look after orphans and widows. That's our calling as a church. And I think the more we do that, the stronger our voice can be when it comes to stopping abortion. So I think it's winnable in the foreseeable future, but it's a stark uphill battle. But there are signs suggesting that we're winning. There are more cases, I should say, more pro-life legislation passed in the last 5 years in the U.S. than the 45 years prior. And there are fewer abortions now than there were in the mid 80s. The trend line is going down. It's right at or just under 1 million a year when it was as high as 1.2 for a while. Now that's still a whole lot, but for those children that are being saved, that's a big deal. Or for those pregnancies that don't end in abortion, those are lives that aren't lost, and that's a big deal.
Fantastic, John. I'm not sure if anyone else has a question. I don't see any hands raised. So if you want to call it a night, you're welcome.
All right. Well, check out my website, Abortion History Museum. It's .wordpress.com, but you can just look up Abortion History Museum, no spaces, and it'll come up. I got lots of good information there. But yeah, take it home to your churches. See how your church can be a pro-life church, and you might find it's not. Maybe you are the pro-life element in your church, and you are the agent of change that can help mobilize God's hand on earth in your community to help make a positive difference and protect some babies.
Yeah, thanks so much, John. And thanks for everybody that stuck until the end. Sure, thanks. I've recorded, so if I end meeting, it will actually save everything. But we'll definitely talk again, and we'll definitely have you on again. I really enjoyed this.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks, John.
How do I sign off?